In Chapter 6, we are going to explore perception and individual decision making. Perception is a process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. It is important in the study of organizational behavior because people's behaviors are based on their perception of what reality is and not on reality itself. In this picture, we see that a cat looking into a mirror and seeing a line, and it says, "What matters most is how you see yourself." But really, this isn't true. Seeing yourself positively is definitely important. However, we must be also keenly aware of how others see us as well. Attribution theory suggests that when we observe an individual's behavior, we attempt to determine whether it was internally or externally caused. That determination depends largely on three factors: distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. Distinctiveness involves comparing a person's behavior on one task with the behavior on other tasks. It looks at whether an individual displays different behaviors in different situations. Consensus involves a comparison of an individual's behavior with that of his or her peers. It occurs if everyone who is faced with a similar situation responds in the same way. And finally, consistency. It's determined by judging if the individual's performance on a given task is consistent over time. It's important to understand the differences between internal and external causation. Internally caused behaviors are those that are believed to be under the personal control of the individual. An example of this is a person's ability. Externally caused behavior is seen as resulting from outside causes. That is, the person is seen as having been forced into a behavior by the situation. An example of this is a difficult task. Think about when a student is late for class. I want you to think about an example of both an internal and external causation. For example, an internal causation may be that they didn't set their alarm clock, but an external causation may be traffic or the weather was really bad. Errors or biases can distort attributions. Fundamental attribution error occurs when we underestimate the influence of external factors and overestimate the influence of internal or personal factors. For example, a sales manager may attribute a team's poor performance of her sales agents to laziness rather than to a competitor's innovative products. Self-serving bias occurs when individuals attribute their own successes to internal factors such as ability or effort while putting the blame for failure on external factors such as luck. We use a number of shortcuts when we judge others, but it's important to recognize that while these shortcuts can be helpful, they can also result in significant distortions. Let's begin with selective perception. Any characteristic that makes a person, object, or event stand out will increase the probability that it will be perceived. Since we can't observe everything going on around us, we engage in selective perception. An example of this may be if you see a football player on a football field, you might not notice him as much. However, if a football player shows up at a ballet class, he will stand out, and therefore you will increase the probability that it will be perceived. When looking at this slide, I want you to write down which one you noticed first, as well as why you think you noticed it first. This is a really interesting exercise that I do on campus with my on-ground classes, and everybody notices things differently for different reasons because of what's important to them or things that stand out most to them. It's just an exercise to show how different our perceptions can be when looking at the same thing. Another shortcut is the halo effect. which occurs when we draw a general impression on the basis of a single characteristic, such as someone's appearance. A third shortcut involves the contrast effects. We do not evaluate a person in isolation. Our reaction to one person is influenced by other individuals we have recently encountered. For example, an interview situation in which one sees a pool of job applicants can distort perception. Distortions of any given candidate's evaluation can occur as a result of his or her place in the interview schedule. This is another exercise I do with my classes when I teach live and on ground. I show them these pictures of cars and I have this list of professionals and I ask them to say which car they think goes with which professional. We then talk about it, and it's interesting to see that some of them reach consensus, but others do not. This is an example of how stereotyping can affect our perceptions, and we'll discuss stereotyping on the next slide. Stereotyping is a fourth shortcut wherein we judge someone on the basis of our perception of the group to which he or she belongs. Generalization is not without its advantages. It is a means of simplifying a complex world, and it permits us to maintain consistency. The problem, of course, is when we inaccurately stereotype. We have to monitor ourselves to make sure we're not unfairly applying a stereotype in our evaluations and our decisions. Now, let's look at some specific applications of shortcuts in organizations. The first application is the employment interview. Evidence indicates that interviewers make perceptual judgments that are often inaccurate. Moreover, early impressions can become quickly entrenched. In fact, research shows that most interviewers' decisions change very little after the first few minutes of an interview. The second application of shortcuts involves performance expectations. Evidence demonstrates that people will attempt to validate their perceptions of reality even when those perceptions are faulty. Self-fulfilling prophecy, also known as the Pygmalion effect, characterizes the fact that people's expectations determine their behavior. In other words, expectations become reality. For example, if a manager has high expectations, the team will perform up to them. But if they have minimal expectations, they will likely only meet them. The third application of shortcuts involves performance evaluations. An employee's performance appraisal is very much dependent upon the perceptual process. Although the appraisal can be objective, many jobs are evaluated in subjective terms. Subjective measures can be problematic because of selective perception, contrast effects, halo effects, and so on. Now, let's explore the link between perception and decision making. Individuals and organizations constantly make decisions. They make choices from among two or more options many times during the day and at different levels of importance or intensity. Usually, decision-making occurs as a reaction to a problem. There is a discrepancy between some current state of affairs and some desired state, requiring consideration of alternative courses of action. One person's problem is another person's satisfactory state of affairs. Every decision requires interpretation and evaluation of information. Data are typically received from multiple sources. The perceptions of the decision maker will decide which data are relevant to the decision and which are not. Alternatives will be developed, and the strengths and weaknesses of each need to be evaluated. This slide demonstrates how different individual perceptions can be. We often hear, do you see the glass half full or half empty? And do you guys remember the gold and white dress versus black and blue dress, as well as the Yanny and Laurel controversies? While some of these may have scientific explanations, They also demonstrate how heavily we rely on perceptions and how different individuals can see the world. Now, let's turn our attention to the rational decision-making model versus bounded rationality and intuition. We often think the best decision maker is rational and makes consistent, value-maximizing choices within specified constraints. This rational decision-making process follows 6 steps, which are shown here in Exhibit 6-3. The first one is to define the problem. The second step is to identify the decision criteria. Then we allocate weights to the criteria, develop alternatives, evaluate the alternatives, and select the best alternative. The rational decision-making model assumes the decision maker has complete information, is able to identify all of the relative options in an unbiased manner, and chooses the option with the highest utility. Most decisions in the real world don't follow the rational model. People are usually content to find an acceptable or reasonable solution to a problem rather than the optimal one. Choices tend to be limited to the neighborhood of the problem symptom and the current alternative. As one expert in decision making put it, most significant decisions are made by judgment rather than by a defined prescriptive model. People are remarkably unaware of making suboptimal decisions. When faced with a complex problem, most people respond by reducing the problem to a level at which it can be readily understood. This is because the limited information processing capability of human beings makes it impossible to assimilate and understand all of the information necessary to optimize. Instead, people satisfice. That is, they seek solutions that are satisfactory and sufficient. Individuals operate within the confines of bounded rationality and construct simplified models that extract the essential features. So how does bounded rationality work? Once a problem is identified, the search for criteria and options begins. The decision maker will identify a limited list made up of more obvious choices, which are easy to find, tend to be highly visible, and represent familiar criteria and previously tried and true solutions. Once this limited set of options is identified, the decision maker will begin reviewing it. The decision maker will begin with options that differ only in relatively small degree from the choices currently in effect. The first option that meets the good enough criteria ends the search. But remember, satisfying is not always a bad idea. It is a simple process that may frequently be more sensible than the traditional rational decision-making model. To use the rational model in the real world, you need to gather a great deal of information about all of the options, compute applicable weights, and then calculate values across a huge number of criteria. All these processes can cost time, energy, and money. If there are many unknown weights and preferences, the fully rational model may not be any more accurate than a best guess. Sometimes a fast and frugal process of solving problems is the best option. Another important decision-making technique is intuition. Perhaps the least rational way of making decisions, intuitive decision-making is an unconscious process created from distilled experience. It occurs outside conscious thought and relies on holistic associations or links between disparate pieces of information. It is fast and is effectively charged, which means it usually engages with the emotions. While intuition isn't rational, it isn't necessarily wrong. Nor does it always contradict rational analysis. Rather, the two can complement one another. The key is neither to abandon nor rely solely on intuition, but to supplement it with evidence and good judgment. Now, let's explore some common biases and errors in decision making. The first is overconfidence bias. Individuals whose intellectual and interpersonal abilities are weakest are most likely to overestimate their performance and ability. The tendency to be too confident about their ideas might keep some from planning how to avoid problems that arise. Investor overconfidence operates in a variety of ways. People think they know more than they do, and it costs them. Investors, especially novices, overestimate not just their own skill in processing information, but also the quality of the information with which they are working. A second bias is anchoring bias. This involves fixating on initial information as a starting point and failing to adequately adjust for subsequent information. Anchors are widely used by people in advertising, management, politics, real estate, and law, where perception skills are important. Anytime a negotiation takes place, so does anchoring. A third bias is confirmation bias. It is a type of selective perception. Here, we seek out information that reaffirms past choices and discount information that contradicts past judgments. The availability bias is the tendency for people to base judgments on information that is readily available. These include recent events, events that evoke emotions, and an example of this is in employee evaluations. Managers tend to give more weight to recent employee behaviors than to behaviors that occurred 6 to 9 months earlier. A tip is do not rely on your manager remembering your key accomplishments. You need to find an appropriate way to share a summary. Typically, self-appraisals are a great opportunity to do so. Escalation of commitment is a bias that occurs when we stay with a decision even when there is clear evidence that it is wrong. This type of bias is most likely to occur when individuals view themselves as responsible for the outcome. An example of when this occurs is, let's say you are working on a project that's supposed to be a year long and costs $5 million, and 7 months into it you realize it's a bad project, but you've already spent $3 million. If you stopped now, you could save the company $2 million and 5 months of time. But a lot of times people will continue on with the project because they look at it instead like they've already spent 7 months as well as $3 million. Another bias is randomness error. which is rooted in our tendency to believe we can predict the outcome of random events. Decision-making becomes impaired when we try to create meaning out of random events. Another bias is risk aversion. This is the tendency to prefer a sure thing instead of a risky outcome. Risk aversion has important implications. Risk-averse employees will stick with the established way of doing their jobs rather than take a chance on innovative and creative methods. Ambitious people with power that can be taken away, for example, most managers, appear to be especially risk-averse, perhaps because they don't want to lose everything they've worked so hard to achieve. Generally speaking, people will more likely engage in risk-seeking behavior for negative outcomes and risk-averse behavior for positive outcomes when under stress. However, risk aversion can lead to stagnation. Finally, hindsight bias is the tendency to believe falsely that one has accurately predicted the outcome of an event after that outcome is already known. Hindsight bias reduces our ability to learn from the past. An example of this is the brick-and-mortar video rental places. The question is, should they have predicted online distribution outlet disruption of the industry? Ethical consideration should be an important criterion in organizational decision-making. The first is utilitarianism, which occurs when decisions are made solely on the basis of their outcomes or consequences. It ideally provides the greatest good for the greatest number. The focus on rights calls on individuals to make decisions consistent with fundamental liberties and privileges as set forth in documents such as the Bill of Rights. This particular criterion protects whistleblowers and organizations. The third criterion involves imposing and enforcing rules fairly and impartially to ensure justice or an equitable distribution of benefits and costs. Union members typically favor this view. Each criterion has advantages and liabilities. A focus on utilitarianism promotes efficiency and productivity, but it can sideline the rights of some individuals, particularly those with minority representation. The focus on rights protects individuals from injury and is consistent with freedom and privacy, but it can also create a legalistic environment that hinders productivity and efficiency. A focus on justice protects the interest of the underrepresented and less powerful, but it can encourage a sense of entitlement that reduces risk-taking, innovation, and productivity. Increasingly, researchers are turning to behavioral ethics, an area of study that analyzes how people actually behave when confronted with ethical dilemmas. Their research tells us that while ethical standards exist collectively, for example in society and organizations, and individually, for example personal ethics, individuals do not always follow ethical standards promulgated by the organizations, and we sometimes violate even our own standards. How might we increase ethical decision-making in organizations? First, sociologist James Q. Wilson suggested the broken windows theory, the idea that decayed and disorderly urban environments may facilitate criminal behavior because they signal antisocial norms. Second, managers should encourage conversations about moral issues. They may serve as a reminder and increase ethical decision-making. Finally, we should be aware of our own moral blind spots, which is the tendency to see ourselves as more moral than we are, and others as less moral than they are. Behavioral ethics research stresses the importance of culture in ethical decision-making. What is ethical in one culture may be unethical in another. Without sensitivity to cultural differences in defining ethical conduct, organizations may encourage unethical conduct without even knowing it. An example of this is bribery There are few global standards for ethical decision making, and in some countries, bribery of government officials is allowed and acceptable. In the United States, it is not only illegal, it is unethical. In this last slide for Chapter 6, we are briefly going to look at creativity. Creativity is the ability to produce novel and useful ideas. These are the ideas that are different from what has been done before, but that are also appropriate to the problem. At the core of the three-stage model of creativity is creative behavior. And really all I want you to know about this model is this core, and that it contains both causes and effects. Causes are predictors of creative behavior, and effects are the outcomes of creative behavior.